Maintenant, préparez-nous au passé.
It is the year of our Lord, 1492, and we find ourselves aboard the Santa Maria, the flagship of Christopher Columbus. Having just discovered the Bahamas and island of Cuba, the Genovese explorer is eager to make his way back to Spain to report these glorious news. Sailing over the Windward Passage, the explorer is roused from his cabin by sailors, crying, "Terra, terra!" Ahead in the foggy distance, Columbus and his men spot two islands. There is a much larger one, almost similar in size to Cuba. He decides to name the island Hispaniola, in honor of his host country. The smaller island, however, is a small and rocky lickspit, seemingly of little worth. Its silhouette resembles a tortoise shell, and Columbus decides to name it Tortuga de Mar, sea turtle. Columbus and his Spanish employers were under the impression that the New World would be theirs, and theirs alone. But the untold wealth and limitless potential of these virgin lands were too much tempting, and it didn't take many decades for the tropical islands to be swarmed by corsairs from England, France, and Holland. They would attack Spanish ships and settlements, but were as often willing to trade with the colonies illegally, usually selling them slaves. Hispaniola became the preferred target of contraband, and Tortuga became a convenient base for the corsairs to resupply and recuperate. It soon became a reputable hideout for anyone seeking refuge from the Spanish. In 1582, a French ship looking to buy furs on Hispaniola was attacked by two galleys, most of the crew being taken prisoner, the rest escaping to Tortuga. The next year, the slave oarsmen aboard a Spanish galley rose up in mutiny, escaping to Tortuga. Spanish officials soon got so frustrated by the contraband trade that they decided to depopulate the north and west coast of Hispaniola. In 1606, direct orders from Madrid ordered everyone to move to the southeast. Not everyone obeyed. In 1607, Spanish rebels occupied Tortuga with a few runaway slaves. Here they traded meat, leather, and slaves for fabrics and clothing with the smugglers. In this hasty departure, the colonists left behind thousands of farm animals, pigs, cattle, horses, and goats, all of whom would multiply in the wilderness. This only made the western coast more attractive. Ships could now stop here to gather provisions, and it was allegedly known as Le Ile de Poissons, the Island of Pigs. French, Dutch, and English adventurers became close allies to the native inhabitants, who taught them to cure the meat in Arawak fashion. It was smoked over a wooden grill called a boucan, or barbecue. Some of the sailors took a special liking to the hunting lifestyle and decided to settle in the uninhabited jungles. They erected hunting camps and spent months in the wilderness, hunting pigs for their meat and cows for their skin. Whenever a ship came by, they went to the coast to exchange their goods for ammunition and liquor. These rugged hunters took on the mantra of Buccaneers, anglicized into Buccaneer. Aside from these scattered groups of hunters, rebels, and runaways, Tortuga went largely unnoticed. Around 1620, England and France began their colonizing efforts in the Antilles, constructing a joint colony on the island of St. Christopher's. Supply ships destined for Christopher's would usually stop by Tortuga on their way back home to load up with wood, used in the production of red dye. However, disaster struck in 1629, when Spanish Admiral Federico de Toledo attacked St. Christopher's. Though he treated colonists and officials with a great amount of respect, many indentured servants even deserted over to him, he still demanded that everyone leave. By now, the French of St. Christopher's had maintained trade with Tortuga, and knowing its history, knew it to be an excellent refuge. A group of 80 men, women, children, and elderly departed for the rocky island, establishing its first colony. Even though the first settlers were French, it was the English that first perceived the idea of a permanent colony on Tortuga. Mastermind of the scheme was a certain Anthony Hilton, Originally active in the North Virginia fur trade, Hilton had been hired to explore the Hudson River in hope of discovering the Northwest Passage, without any luck. Ending up on St. Christopher, he caught tobacco fever and managed to get hold of a plantation. This one was destroyed by Carib Indians, but a second plantation provided a good yield, which Hilton brought back to Ireland in 1627. Hilton was now convinced that he could do better than just a plantation. Why not an entire island? Though he managed to secure the finances, Hilton had also made a substantial number of enemies, both in the colonies and the high rungs of English society. Partly because of his tendency to deal with pirates of all nations, and not being above piratical deeds himself. He eventually managed to settle on the island of Nevis, but after the Spanish attack in 1629, control was seized by one of Hilton's enemies. He only returned to the island to pick up some belongings and loyalists, all of whom he moved over to his new target, Tortuga. He had likely learned of this spot from his dealings with pirates and smugglers. Hilton settled on the southern part of the island, after which he swore fealty to the Company of Adventurers for the Plantation of the Island of Providence, Henrietta, and adjacent islands, usually shortened to the Providence Company. This was a Puritan organization looking to expand West Indian colonies, largely to serve as privateering bases to attack the Spanish. In return for the financing, the company expected 20% of all profits made by the islanders, and they gave them 6 cannons and a magazine of ammunition, which was used to construct a small fort. Finding the name of Tortuga unbefitting their Puritan tastes, the company decided to rename the colony Island of Association. Naturally, the Puritans wanted to make the island into a model colony, a bastion of the true faith. A minister arrived in 1632, but he had to leave shortly thereafter, finding most of the denizens to be a rough and piratical bunch, many of them former freebooters. Perhaps they should have listened to the father's words of temperance and hygiene, for disease soon began taking its toll. By 1634, most of the English emigrants had perished from fever. Even though Hilton himself was a bit of a tobacco nut, the company was more interested in the harvest of exotic woods for the production of dye. They even forbade anyone but direct company employees from harvesting it. However, it was impossible to enforce this rule owing to English laws banning dyes. Records of company ships carrying wood tend to go strangely silent the moment they reach England, presumably because the cargo was smuggled in. The rest had to be sold in France or Holland. Indeed, much of the cutting was done by French and Dutchmen, with Hilton himself pocketing the proceeds. Over time, both Hilton and the company started employing slaves in the cutting. But Hilton did seemingly not rest on his laurels. He was an active participant in the company, making plans to colonize Florida and expand trade with the natives of Darien. But when the company's ship arrived to trade with Darien, Hilton decided instead to use it for his illegal commerce with the French and Dutch smugglers. The company soon found it impossible to secure any payments from him, and the tobacco planters complained of him taking all the proceeds. Furthermore, Hilton was still in debt over his colonizing efforts in the Lesser Antilles, and the creditors there were talking of arresting company ships as compensation. Furthermore, Hilton had made Association into a pirate haven, welcoming anyone who attacked Spanish shipping. The company soon had enough of Hilton's mischief, and in 1634 sent out orders for his arrest. By now, Hilton had already passed away and been replaced by Christopher Wormley. The company decided to let Association be, but the days of the colony were numbered. In the same year as Hilton's passing, an Irish sergeant major named John Murphy murdered someone and fled to the Spanish, complaining of religious persecution. He convinced them that Tortuga was ripe for the taking, and an expedition of 250 Spaniards was mustered to uproot the Buccaneer nest. Led by Rui Fernandez de Fuermayor, the small armada entered Tortuga harbor in January of 1635, under pomp and splendor, had they not run aground. The defenders, however, were poorly organized, having no watches or military discipline. The Spanish were able to make landfall, capture the fort, and defeat the counterattack. Murphy was shot in the forehead, but managed to survive. By 1650, he had obtained a knighthood in the Order of Santiago. Wormley didn't have much of a fight in him. As soon as the Spanish vessels showed up, he loaded his personal belongings aboard a ship and set sail, leaving Fuer Mayor to do with the colony as he pleased. His soldiers dispersed into the countryside, hunting the settlers like swine. Anyone who surrendered was hanged. Women, children, the elderly, none were spared. The settlement was razed, and the victorious Spaniards returned home. Wormley returned to London, where the company had him discharged for cowardice and negligence. A new governor named Reskeimer was sent to Tortuga, but he died of a fever as soon as he arrived, and the 80 colonists elected a governing council. They had 150 slaves among them, but many of these were being kidnapped by French sailors coming to cut wood. Meanwhile in London, the company was looking to hire a Huguenot Frenchman named François de la Haye to serve as the new governor, hopefully being able to secure a bond between the French and English on Tortuga. De la Haye soon left without the company's permission, but when he arrived, he found that the remaining slaves had risen up in rebellion, driving the colonists over to the west coast of Hispaniola, Saint-Domingue. In 1639, a contingent of English and Frenchmen from Nevis, the island settled by Hilton, emigrated to Tortuga. Among them were 300 men, 40 women, and 20 slaves, carried in a 200-ton bark of 12 guns. They rebuilt the old colony and appointed a guy called Captain James as governor, or president, and in 1640 requested protection of the Providence Company. Help would never arrive. Even though Captain James seemed decently competent, he made a mistake of antagonizing the French settlers on Tortuga, who now began to look for protection from their own countrymen. One adventurer departed to St. Christopher, currently governed by a Knight Hospitaller, Philippe de Poissy. De Poissy took great interest in the plight of Tortuga, but for an unusual reason. His orders stated that all colonists must adhere to the Catholic faith, but a trickle of Huguenot refugees had fled there after the siege of La Rochelle. De Poissy had the idea to give them their own colony to get rid of them, and Tortuga looked like a prime candidate. All he needed was a leader, a figurehead for the Tortuga expedition. He would find one in a certain Jean Levasseur, already a seasoned pirate and colonist in the West Indies. Levasseur had sailed on the Pierre de Essambuc, the pirate captain responsible for establishing the French colony on St. Christopher, laying the foundations of the French Caribbean Empire. Most importantly, Levasseur wasn't just any old sea dog, but a skilled engineer with an eye for defenses. His training would be essential for the protection of the colony. De Poissy and Levasseur drafted terms of agreement, including religious tolerance and taxes paid to the Crown and Company. Provisions and materials were provided for, and the document was signed in 1641. Joined by 40 Huguenots, Levasseur set sail. At Port Amagon, he mustered 50 additional Buccaneers, most of them Protestant. Proceeding to Tortuga, he presented himself as a liberator, having come to free the Frenchmen from the oppressive Englishmen. Most of the Frenchmen did join his side, President James surrendered, and the English were expelled. Now, Levasseur could get to work. To see the improvements from his own eyes, we firstly have to understand the geographical situation on Tortuga Island. The name of Tortuga is appropriate because the island truly resembles a tortoise shell. It is tall, hard and jagged, consisting mostly of steep rocks. The northern coast is completely inaccessible to vessels, with only the southern coast being open. From here to Hispaniola, it is separated by a 2-mile channel. At the southern coast is found a small bay, if it can even be called a bay. Its size and depth is severely exaggerated on period maps in order to emphasize its prominence. In reality, it is quite small. It is the only decent anchorage on Tortuga. The bay is closed off by several sandbars, between which are 2 narrow passages through which only lighter ships can pass. A large number of vessels can anchor in the harbor, with the slight crescent providing some protection from the wind, with most of the protection coming from the rocky highlands or neighboring Hispaniola. But Tortuga is far from a perfect anchorage. Its benefit lies in its isolation and defensibility. On the shore was constructed a settlement known as Vasseur. The previous colonists seem to have constructed batteries on the shoreline, and Levasseur erected a redoubt here, but it was only to be the first line of defense. 600 paces from the beach lay a hill topped by a flat summit, watching over the harbor. In the middle of the summit stood a 30-feet rock, the base of which provided a spring of fresh water. This was the perfect location for a castle. Vasseur constructed terraces on the summit, capable of housing 400 men. The two corners facing the sea were equipped with spearhead-shaped outcroppings called redans, built to provide more angles for the cannons. His own dwelling was built at the top of the rock, reached by a series of steps, surmounted by an iron ladder which had to be hoisted down from above. Here he likewise kept a storehouse and magazine. It is also said that he kept an iron cage, too short to stand in and too narrow to lie in, known as Little Hell, and reserved for his worst of enemies. Several guns were mounted on the rock and many more on the platform below, to assume full command of the harbor. The citadel was named after the iconic rock, Fort de la Roche, Fort on the Rock. The safety of Vasseur's colony began attracting the freebooters that had once fled it. Here they could offload their plunder and hunting goods, in return for liquor and ammunition. Their ships could be repaired, new crewmen mustered, before setting off on new adventures. The Spanish soon caught wind of the revitalized stronghold, and in 1643 they organized an expedition to uproot it once more. A fleet of 6 ships and 500 men departed San Domingo, confident that they'd be victorious once more. From his eyrie at Fort de la Roche, Vasseur spotted the Spanish advance and hastily made preparations. As soon as they entered cannon range, the fort opened fire. One of the Spanish vessels sank, and the rest retreated to shelter at nearby Cayon. Here they made landfall without any opposition. They thought they could sneak up on the fort and take it, but Vasseur had set up an ambush, ending 200 Spaniards and forcing the rest to retreat. Tortuga had been secured. Back on St. Christopher's, de Poissy was now starting to regret his decision. Tortuga had suddenly blossomed into a strong, independent colony, and if allowed to grow, it could become a huge bastion in the West Indies to challenge French religious authority. He sent a delegation to the small island, complimenting Vasseur on the condition of the colony, his many achievements, and victory over the Spaniards. They said that de Poissy was so impressed that he wished to see Vasseur in person. Vasseur saw right through it, and told them that he was still needed on the colony owing to the Spanish threat. The delegation returned home. De Poissy had revealed his hand, and Vasseur used it to make his next move. His temperament shifted from a cautious and moderate leader to a cruel tyrant. He suspended Catholic worship, burned the local chapel, and drove away the priest, a Capuchin named Père Marc. Surprisingly, he neither spared his co-religionists when he expelled the Protestant minister. Power laid in his hands, not the church's. Next, he levied a special tax on all of the hides brought in from Saint-Domingue. However, Vasseur had remained a loyal vassal, always denying Poissy's invitations, but with mock humility. Eventually, this too changed, and Vasseur finally saw his opportunity to declare open rebellion. One of his Buccaneers ships had seized a Spanish ship and found aboard a statue of the Madonna in silver. De Poissy, a faithful Catholic and member of the order, naturally demanded that Vasseur send it over. Vasseur sent him a Madonna. It was made of wood. Vasseur said that the Catholics were too pious to notice a difference. De Poissy was outraged, but he soon became preoccupied with the King of France looking to replace him as governor. This allowed Vasseur to continue his reign. It was now that Tortuga truly flourished as a buccaneer capital, with dozens of ships coming in to offer tribute to the pirate king at Fort de la Roche. Merchant vessels paid homage to him as they traded plunder and hides for brandy and ammunition. The king himself possessed a small trading ship for running errands to France, and a freebooter commanded by Robert Martin, who raided for slaves in Campeche. Meanwhile, the Protestant population was growing, with Tortuga becoming a heretic stronghold. This was alarming for de Poissy, as he would be given the blame for allowing such a nest to develop. In 1652, a desperate Poissy soon contracted Navy Commander Chevalier de Fontenay to reassert control of the island. In return, Fontenay would be made the new governor of Tortuga. Since Vasseur was firmly entrenched in his base at Fort de la Roche, the planning and recruitment of the expedition was done under utmost secrecy, and was officially supposed to be a raid on the Spanish Main. The force intended to sail divided, before joining together not far from Tortuga. But, before the fleet could even depart, they received a piece of news that changed everything. Vasseur was dead. He had been assassinated. So, what happened? Vasseur had no children of his own, and was growing concerned with succession in case of his death. He decided to appoint as heirs two of his lieutenants, Martin and Thibault, who according to some sources were his nephews. It is unknown if this Martin is the same Martin that commanded Vasseur's pirate ship. Either way, Vasseur appointed these young men as his heirs. It might have worked out had Vasseur not desired the mistress of Thibault and taken her for himself. With or against her will, we do not know. Thibault was angered and consulted Martin for revenge. The two decided to do Vasseur in. Knowing the tyrant to be disliked by Poissy, the monarchy, and even some of the Buccaneers, they hoped to secure their goodwill by regiciding this piratical Caesar. However, they had to wait until the perfect moment, since Vasseur was cautious and seldom left his residence. One day when he climbed down to inspect a storehouse on the esplanade, Thibault fired at him with a musket. The governor was wounded, but drew his sword to defend himself. As Martin rushed in to grapple him, Vasseur caught sight of the treacherous Thibault, holding the smoking musket. For a second, he was stunned by the betrayal, allowing Thibault to close in and finish the tyrant with his dagger. Vasseur had governed Tortuga for 11 years and passed away in 1652. As soon as he heard the news, de Fontenay decided to strike. Sailing into the harbor, he was met by brisk fire from the fort and redoubt. Just like the Spaniards had 9 years prior, the frigate retreated to nearby Cayenne, where the French made landfall and marched into the interior. However, the settlers lacked the will to fight, and Thibault and Martin swiftly surrendered, under the conditions that they'd be pardoned. Fontenay was glad to take command without a fight, and order was swiftly restored. Catholic settlers moved back, the chapel was rebuilt, and the priests soon returned. Akin to Vasseur, Fontenay wasn't one to rest on his laurels, and soon departed himself on piratical expeditions into Spanish territory. These were so successful that he soon caught the attention of the Spanish authorities. One evening when they were celebrating in the fort, they received news of a Spanish counterattack. This flotilla consisted of 180 soldiers, distributed among 5 large ships and a few smaller ones. On their way to Tortuga, they captured a Buccaneer fleet, letting one of the ships escape to tell the news. Just like the previous attacks, they sailed into the harbor, got fired upon, retreated to Cayenne, and made landfall. De Fontenay's brother, Othman, marched out to oppose them, but fire from the Spanish ships obliged them to petty skirmishing tactics. The French soon retreated back to the fort. For 3 days, nothing happened. The Spanish scouted the terrain while the French fortified, confident that the fort was impregnable. But the clever Spaniards soon found a flaw in its design. The bastions of the fort were placed against a larger hill, which was considered inaccessible. So, the Spanish decided to access it. The cannons had to be dismounted from their carriages and carried by hand by multiple slaves. It was both dangerous and arduous, but it paid off. The governor woke up one morning to a cannonball bursting through his window. The French soon found the mansion untenable and had to take cover. However, they managed to counter the Spanish battery by constructing a breastwork on the esplanade, from whence they could return fire. In return, the Spanish moved their battery to another hill, where they were able to clear the breastwork. Fontenay resolved to make a sortie, placing Othman in charge of 60 men, with the orders to destroy the Spanish battery. They were to attack at night, but a slave caught wind of the orders, escaped, and told the Spanish. When Othman attacked, the Spanish were waiting for him, and reinforcements were on their way. Nonetheless, the brave Frenchmen managed to break the Spanish defense, blew up the powder magazine before getting their asses back to safety. A valiant attempt, but the next day, the Spanish reinforced their battery and began the bombardment in earnest. Things were looking good for the attackers. Then the rain started falling. Mud made it difficult to move supplies up the hill, and the cannons and ammunition became difficult to handle. Sickness broke out in the wretched conditions, and the expedition was losing heart. However, a French turncoat informed them that things were looking worse in the fort, with the Frenchmen growing mutinous over Fontenay's stubbornness. The Spanish decided to send his turncoat down to negotiate, but Fontenay punished his betrayal with a shot in the head. The men, who wanted to negotiate, were not pleased. As Othman was making his rounds, some traitors fired upon him before escaping to the Spanish and saying they had ended the governor's brother. The Spanish commander, Don Gabriel, was disgusted by this and went out with a flag of truce, saying that if this was true, he intended to hang the cowardly murderers. More and more Frenchmen were deserting by the day, and Fontenay soon decided to call quits. Fontenay managed to secure an honorary military surrender, marching out of the fort with drums beating, flags flying, and muskets loaded. They were permitted to repair 2 broken ships in the harbor, having no other way to return to France. In return, Don Gabriel took Othman as a hostage, fearing possible retaliations from the piratical Fontenay. Othman was treated exceedingly well, however, more as a guest than a prisoner. When Othman returned to Tortuga, the Spanish had directed a garrison to ensure that the island was being evacuated. It consisted of 100 soldiers, along with 40 Irishmen, led by the aforementioned John Murphy. One of the evacuation ships was commanded by Martin and Thibon. They seemed to have no idea where they were going. Eventually, they decided to maroon all of the women, children, and elderly off Jamaica and went on a piratical cruise to the Main. The marooned were rescued by a Dutch ship, and no one knows what happened to the assassins of Le Vasseur. Fontenay, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to avenge his defeat on Tortuga. They landed at Cayenne, where the Spaniards retreated and prepared an ambush. The ambush was spoiled by a barking dog and defeated by Fontenay and Othman. The French then went to the old Spanish battery on the mountainside, using it to devastate the garrison. When reinforcements arrived, Fontenay realized that the trick was up. He and his men fled to the ship and sailed back home. So ended the French governance on Tortuga. The Spanish attempted to make Tortuga a permanent possession. However, in 1655, Hispaniola came under attack from an English fleet led by Admiral Penn. Sent to the Americas by Oliver Cromwell, his ambition was to carve out an English colonial empire on the great island of St. Dominic. All of the island's forces had to be pulled to the capital, and Tortuga was hastily abandoned. The settlers were pulled back, the town set on fire, and the fort blown up. Nothing remains today but a few ruins. Alright, we're like more than halfway through the recording or something, so I need to get some more. I need to get a fresh cuppa, and I need to get some rum in me, so I don't know, let's have a musical break here. Alright, let's see here. Here's the old rum. Let's take a shot here. It really burns your throat. Powering up. Let's get some tea. Still, that was really hot. Almost worse than the rum, to be honest. The English never succeeded in taking St. Dominic, but they did capture Jamaica as a consolation. Many Buccaneers were invited here to help fight local guerrillas and serve as a privateering force to protect the colony. However, some of the locals got restless and ambitious. In 1656, a man named Elias Watts sailed from Jamaica to Tortuga, finding the island deserted. He settled down with his family and 12 colonists, and after meeting with some success, he received a commission as governor. 150 men moved in with him, forming the core of the new Tortuga colony. They were soon bolstered by additional English and Frenchmen, until they felt so bold as to attack Spanish property. The casus belli was revenge against Spanish cruelties committed against Tortuga settlers. Watts gave a commission to Capitaine L'Isle, giving him command of a frigate and an army of 400 men, most of them French. The expedition sailed to Santiago and made landfall outside of town. It was the eve of Good Friday, and the denizens were busy celebrating, allowing the impious Buccaneers to enter the town under the cover of darkness. 30 opponents were decommissioned, and the governor captured while still in his pajamas. He complained that the French and Spanish had recently signed a peace treaty, but the Buccaneers said that they were operating under an English commission. He was liberated for a ransom, and the city looted of anything valuable. The churches stripped of their bells, ornaments, and sacred vessels. The Spanish attempted to ambush the pirates on their way back, but the ambuscade was defeated, and the victors sailed off. They were so happy with the assault that Captain L'Isle was awarded tribute by his own men, becoming so rich that he could sail back to France. During the crossing, he was cheated by the captain of the passenger ship and thrown overboard. Some Frenchmen were now becoming jealous of Watt's success and planned to reclaim the island for the glory of France. One of the original settlers of Tortuga from 20 years prior, Jérémie de Rosset, obtained from the king himself a commission as governor of Tortuga. However, Watts was popular among the locals and likewise supported by Jamaica, so de Rosset travelled next to London, where he managed to get backing from the English government, provided he would give the English colonists the same rights as the French. Raising a small band of adventurers, Rosset travelled to Jamaica in 1659, where he showed his credentials and commission to the governor. When Watts caught wind of this, he panicked and sailed with his family to New England. Rosset moved in the very next day after Watts' departure, but soon found the island so unfitting for his health that he moved to a more secluded spot on Saint-Domingue, possibly near Port-au-Prince. Command of the island was left to his nephew, Frédéric de Champs de la Place. Meanwhile, some Englishmen refused to give up command of the colony, especially after Rosset had torn down the English colours and replaced them with the French. The Jamaican governor was quite shocked over this, believing that Rosset was operating under English authority, not knowing he likewise had authority from the King of France. At any rate, in 1662, a small expedition made landfall and marched on the house of Laplace. But he wasn't at home. As soon as he heard of this scheme, he got together his men, surrounded his own house, and captured the expedition without any bloodshed. They were sent back to Jamaica without punishment, but were captured by the Spanish on the way. Unfortunate. I bet the Inquisition is gonna have a field day with those boys. The English had not given up hope. When a new governor was appointed, new orders came from the king to use his utmost endeavors to reduce said Frenchmen and said island to obedience. The council promptly agreed to make it so. A letter from Jamaica makes it quite clear why control of Tortuga was of utmost interest. There are 20 privateers of all nations under the protection of Jamaica, which being now debarred from taking in their prizes there, will from Tortuga take French and Portugal commissions or none at all, and will hinder all trade to and from Jamaica and obstruct Spanish ships from going there to buy slaves. In fine, if Tortuga be not reduced to the obedience of the governor of Jamaica, it will cause the ruin thereof and the harbour of rogues and pirates who make it their living, by which means the inhabitants of Jamaica will desert the country. In short, the Jamaicans viewed Tortuga as a rival pirate port that would divert attention away from them. Jamaica as a growing colony needed pirates for their defense and economic expansion, but with Tortuga as an independent port, pirates could go there instead. Note how the letter refers to their own pirates as privateers, and the Tortuga ones as pirates. There was no difference. This is just typical colonial politics. My side good, your side bad. An expedition was soon outfitted and led by Captain Abraham Langford and Colonel Samuel Barry. This strange expedition was seemingly a failure, possibly because they underestimated the strength of Tortuga, and somehow they ended up in Petit Goave. Here the local Buccaneers decided that they liked Captain Langford so much as to elect him governor. Even still, one colonist described him as follows. Captain Langford speaks not French, nor does he understand it. He is a man of no wisdom, his interest in Jamaica and person despicable, his fortune forlorn, his honesty questionable. Not exactly a glowing review. Back in London, a certain Dr. Stubbs raised the topic of retaking Tortuga one final time. The king declined it. It had little economic and strategic interest. No English colonists would settle there, and the king did not want to risk a quarrel with France. So ended any hope for an English Tortuga. Rosette's health eventually got so bad that he had to return to France, where he soon ended up locked in the Bastille. You're probably wondering how he ended up there. You see, the French West India Company, founded a few years prior to manage France's colonial affairs, wanted to buy Tortuga to get in on the precious fur market. However, Rosette didn't like the offer and tried instead to sell the island to England. For his lack of patriotism, he was tossed into jail. A year behind bars put him to his senses, and on November 15, 1664, he signed a contract to sell the island for 10,000 livres. The company decided to appoint a certain Bertrand d'Ogeron as the governor of Tortuga. He is the man responsible for creating the colony that would last until the days of Napoleon. Native to Anjou, Bertrand had served in the marine before engaging in several failed colonial schemes. Throughout his early career, Bertrand was scammed, shipwrecked, and swindled. He eventually joined a band of Buccaneers and met some success when he colonized Léogâne, Petit-Goâve, and Port-à-Margot on Saint-Domingue. None of his efforts met with any success, and it was by raw fortune that the company decided to take over and appoint him governor. This was part of Louis XIV's colonial policy. He wanted men who were familiar with the region and its unstable politics. d'Ogeron received this happy news in February of 1665, when he was breaking his back trying to save his colony at Port-à-Margot. He was more than happy to hear that the company had taken over his failing finances. De la Place swiftly surrendered when d'Ogeron made landfall on Tortuga, where the new governor announced the new incumbent, received by cries of "Vive le roi! Vive le roi!" Bertrand's biggest problem was the low population of the colonies. Tortuga, the capital, had only 250 inhabitants. Writing home to Paris, Bertrand explained how most of the men on Saint-Domingue, approximately 600, lived in small groups, sustaining themselves on hunting, tobacco farming, and trading with passing ships. They were anarchists who obeyed no authority, and would frequently attack any vessels that came by, Spanish or not. It was his intention to forcefully disarm these men and relocate them to the burgeoning colonies. These ambitions naturally clashed with the free spirit of the Buccaneers, and the settlers on Saint-Domingue quickly grew to detest Bertrand and the company. He forbade any trade with the Dutch, even though Dutch smugglers had been essential for the early growth of the colony. Indeed, he soon banned any independent trade with the Buccaneers. All commerce had to go through the company. Trouble was brewing. One of Bertrand's solutions to the negative sentiment was the importation of women. The colonies had always had a huge gender gap, making it impossible for white settlers to build actual societies in the Caribbean. Bertrand saw women both as an opportunity to expand the population and to tame the wild Buccaneers. The quality of these women is disputed. Some sources regarded them as the purest and most tame of gentlewomen, whilst others called them prostitutes from the hospitals, abandoned wretches raked up from the mud of the capital, disgusting compounds of filth and impurity of the grossest kind. Whoa, that's kind of harsh. It's doubtful, however, that the Buccaneers would have complained, not exactly being parades of green flags themselves, and generally being desperate for any women at all. Nonetheless, these femmes were quick at adapting to the local climate, soon learning to shoot, ride, and hunt with their husbands. Even still, most of the men remained unmarried. Even though war broke out between France and England in 1666, Jamaica and Saint-Domingue signed an agreement of perpetual neutrality. Both colonies were more interested in buccaneering against the Spanish than fighting each other, and the buccaneers of either nation would more often cooperate than fight. Even though Tortuga and Jamaica were rivals, both places benefited from the prosperity of the other. And it was during the rule of d'Ogeron that Tortuga saw its height as a pirate stronghold. It was home to infamous names like Henry Morgan and François l'Olonnais, who made the island his home and brought home great treasure. However, any further interest in Olonnais will have to be delegated to my dedicated episode on him, spanning about an hour. Feel free to watch it after this one to learn more about the horrifying career of this cruel and terrible pirate. Another important pirate who operated out of Tortuga was a ship's surgeon, Alexander Exquemelin. He later published a famous book on the Buccaneers, in which he gave a detailed description of the island of Tortuga in the 1660s. Let's take a look at what he said. The island of Tortuga was divided into 4 parts. The oldest plantations could be found on the mountain in the northern highlands of Tortuga. It is very mountainous and full of rocks, yet grown with lofty trees, whose roots would grow like ivy over the stones. The second part was Ringo, located on the western part of the island. A few plantations were located here, but hunting was presumably the big name of the game here. The third part is called the Middle Plantation, its soil being almost fresh in the 1660s, but only being good for the growing of tobacco. Finally, we have the lowlands, or Vasseur Era, on the southern coast of the island. This is where the town of Caen was located. The governor's mansion was located in the highlands just above town. After the destruction of Fort de la Roche, construction of a new fort began in 1666 under an engineer named Blondel. D'Ogeron finished the construction in 68. Located below de la Roche, closer to the bay, it consisted of a round tower flanked by a lower courtyard, defended on the seaside by a curtain wall with firing embrasures, and on the land side a wooden palisade with half bastions. However, D'Ogeron didn't believe much in fortresses. He was able to convince the government not to construct a big citadel on Saint-Domingue, since the Buccaneers were much better at luring attackers into the woods and whittling them down through ambushes. All the enemy could do was to burn down a few huts, which were easily rebuilt anyway. So the defense of the colony was quite dynamic. The inhabitants sustained themselves on hunting, imported provisions, and a few locally grown vegetables like manioc and potato, and also wild fruits such as apples, pineapples, and paraguays. Wine was extracted from palm trees, and the leaves were used for thatching the roofs of buildings. Of note was a local wood called candlewood, which burned very well, and was used for lighting at night when the locals were fishing. The town was likewise host to a great many pigeons. Looking at the nature and the economy of Tortuga, it is obvious that it wasn't supposed to last as a permanent capital. The ruggedness was unsuitable for shipping, and many sources mention how unpleasant and flat-out unhealthy it was living on the island. Its only good quality was its isolation and defensibility, making it an excellent place for kickstarting the golden age of piracy. The early pirates could use it as a gathering ground, but when the Spaniards came knocking, they could easily escape into the wilderness. After the French and English had solidified and their colonies became safer, pirates didn't need isolation anymore. The second reason for Tortuga's eventual decline was its dependence on tobacco. The soil really wasn't good enough for growing anything else, and on the flip side, Tortuga tobacco was said to be the best in the Americas. Now, early on in the 17th century, it was believed that tobacco would become the go-to cash crop. So across New England and the Caribbean, there was an overinvestment in the tobacco business, which led to a collapse in prices. Eventually, the Dutch would introduce sugar from Brazil, and the white gold, powered by slave labor, would overtake tobacco by miles. The rise of the sugar industry was already stirring in the 1660s, and the French and English both would look beyond Tortuga for better soil. So in that sense, Tortuga was the ground zero for Caribbean colonialism. It was a place where both the English and French experimented with their empires, both in terms of piracy, illegal trade with the Spanish, and cash crops. Tortuga, being a center for offloading pirate plunder, was naturally a prominent slave market. The early tobacco planters employed African slaves taken from Portuguese ships, but as the island began developing into a pirate stronghold, slave raids were soon launched into Yucatan. In 1652, Tortuga marauders seized the residence of an entire village, consisting of about 60 families. The crew members took their personal slaves and sold the rest to the highest bidder. The next year, an eyewitness said that there were 50 Africans and 150 Native Americans on Tortuga, both men, women, and children. Mortality among them was extremely high, mostly due to disease. Some managed to escape across the water on makeshift rafts. When the Spanish captured the island, they found between 70 and 80 Mayas. The fate of these poor souls among the Spanish is uncertain. D'Ogeron was quick to notice the problems with slavery. He feared that overuse and mass importation would lead to violence and rebellion, so he instituted a law that no plantationer was allowed to employ more slaves than white servants. Both he and his successor had an incredible foresight, which would foolishly be ignored by their descendants, as Saint-Domingue degenerated into an abominable slave society in the 18th century. The excess of the white overlords culminated in the Haitian Revolution, during which most of the white and mixed-race population were massacred. D'Ogeron left for France in 68 to discuss policy and acquire more colonists, leaving the colony in the hands of Philippe de Poinsay. He returned the next year and was happily met by fireworks. Actually, it was Buccaneers shooting at him. You remember D'Ogeron's restrictions on free trade? They were pissed about it. He had managed to make them trade exclusively with company ships, but now they wanted him to remove the ban on international trade. The flames had been further fanned by a pair of Dutch merchants, both named Peter, who incited the rebels and offered them goods at better prices. When a French officer came to stop them, the Dutch arrested him aboard their ship. The nerve of them. D'Ogeron quickly got to work. He boarded the Dutch ship and freed his officer, and sailed next to Petit Goave, where the Buccaneers fired upon him. He had to run back to Tortuga. Here he learned that the men of Léogane were planning on enlisting the Buccaneers and farmers and march on Tortuga itself. A message was quickly sent to St. Christopher's, asking for reinforcements. However, the naval commander stationed there refused, saying he could not abandon his post. D'Ogeron had to deal with the uprising alone. Meanwhile, the rebels had anchored a ship in the harbor of Tortuga, where they extorted any arrivals for tribute. D'Ogeron pooped his pants and sent a desperate letter to France, asking that he'd be given governorship of Florida instead. He had previously had an ambition of setting up a colony there to control trade in the Florida Straits. The government realized how idiotic this was, and just sent a frigate to relieve him. When relief came, the rebels were quickly dealt with, arrested, and made to swear an allegiance to the crowning company. He then went from port to port, demanding the same show of allegiance from each of the locals. Most of them met him under arms, but agreed begrudgingly. Only Petit Goave resisted. D'Ogeron drove the resistance back to the woods and burned their coastal habitations. Even this could not quell the rebellious sentiment, as the core issue had not been addressed. When the navy departed, the rebels sat down with D'Ogeron to negotiate. They had now realized that as long as the government sent men of war to patrol the coast, foreign merchantmen could not come and trade. They therefore agreed to submit to D'Ogeron on the condition that all French vessels were permitted to trade in Saint-Domingue, by paying the company a 5% tax on all goods bought and sold, foreigners excluded. And so, peace came to the nascent colony. Everyone were friends again, and luckily so, for war had just broken out between France and the Netherlands. The Buccaneers had new work ahead of them. Expeditions against the Dutch marked the last hurrahs of the Tortuga Buccaneers, some of them led by D'Ogeron personally. England and Spain signed a peace treaty in 1670, after which Jamaica began to crack down on its piratical activities. The Buccaneers turned to Saint-Domingue as their new sponsor, and Tortuga would continue to flourish as a pirate nest. However, with the rest of the colony growing, the isolated island was increasingly becoming supplanted by other places like Port-de-Paix and Petit Goave. These places had better harbors and were more suitable to live in, making them decent places for retirement. Yet, for the rest of D'Ogeron's magnanimous reign, Tortuga would flourish as the colonial capital and the nest of piracy. In 1675, his failing health obliged him to return to France, where he passed away the next year. On the passing of Bertrand in 76, Tortuga had only a population of 120, with 80 servants employed in tobacco and food production. The new governor, de Poinsay, was concerned with the situation. He believed that Tortuga was vital for the defense of the entire colony, and wanted to repopulate it with Buccaneers. He revitalized defenses, setting up a battery with 24-pounder guns, and a garrison of 20 in the fort. He wanted to issue privateering commissions that demanded the privateers only sell their booty at Tortuga, but this doesn't seem to have worked. In 1681, the population had grown to 374, including women, children, servants and slaves. But it was still dwarfed by the neighboring Port-de-Paix, inhabited by 700 souls. Tobacco was the only thing keeping the colony alive, as Tortuga tobacco was esteemed the best in the Americas, at least according to Poinset's successor, Coucy. Though initially optimistic, this sentiment was curbed as the island produced less and less, and tobacco prices remained unprofitably low. By 1691, the population had fallen to only 100, and Coucy had given up hope. The following year, when Governor Ducasse was expected to list the king's officers in the colony, Tortuga was omitted with the following remark: "It is a rock, seemingly inaccessible, where there are about 60 to 70 armed men, and where trade is conducted for only 700 to 800 écus. This island is of no use today. The people who are there only stay out of pride and to live comfortably." The next year, Ducasse announced that he would gradually remove people from Tortuga, but only out of, quote, necessity and kindness, unquote. By 1694, it had been entirely abandoned. Around 1712, the government of Saint-Domingue considered turning it into a leper colony, but the Minister of the Navy prohibited it, since the island could be used as a refuge in case of an epidemic or enemy attack. The isolation and abandonment of Tortuga still made it a suitable base for those kinds of pirates who had no sponsors and flew no flag but the black. In 1720, it was remarked how it was used by pirates in times of peace, as a hunting ground and a retreat to supply. From here, the pirates would surprise ships passing by, and make incursions at night into the plantations on the neighboring isle. Saint-Domingue was frequently threatened by the flying gang pirates of the 1710s, and it isn't impossible that they occasionally used Tortuga as a staging ground. However, I know of no names associated with the island. Today, Tortuga is about as sparsely inhabited as before its abandonment. People still live in the same areas as the 17th century, with Cayon or Basseterre being the dominant settlement. They primarily seem to sustain themselves on fishing. There's very little development, and there are no cars. Archaeologists are interested in excavating the forts and possibly the town and harbor, but there are few opportunities for investment, and Haiti, the country forged out of Saint-Domingue, has been unstable since 2010. Who knows what might be found in the soil of Tortuga, the cradle of Caribbean piracy. If you enjoyed my deep dive into this pirate haven, do not hesitate to support the channel by liking the video and leaving a comment with your thoughts. Monetary support in the form of channel memberships, donations and Patreon support helps immensely. More pirate videos coming soon. A lot of you watching engage in various forms of creative endeavors, ranging from novel writing to game design. Some of you have expressed interest or contacted me for consultation in your projects. So with the advice from one of my clients, I have set up a Fiverr account where you can now hire me to consult on your project. I offer research, proofreading, editing, and critique. Or we can just spitball ideas. You'll find a link in the video description or pinned comment below. Otherwise, support Gold Gunpowder by liking the video, giving your thoughts on the video, subscribing, and clicking the notification bell. Monetarily by buying some merch or becoming a Patreon supporter, where $1 a month gets you early, ad-free, and sponsor-free access to my videos.